Hey, grade eights, and welcome to your first lesson from Unit 7. Unit 7 is on data analysis and probability. What you're going to be looking at here is different kinds of graphing, not necessarily you graphing so much, more you analyzing graphs and you seeing what graphs are misleading and seeing different ways that graphs can be presented to you. The other side of this is going to be some probability stuff in the latter half of the unit, and this probably will be the unit we finish up on. I might post some mild stuff from Unit 8, but we've been told to kind of get as far as we can given the weird year that we've had. So we'll see what happens. But for right now, let's start with Unit 7. So today you're going to be looking at choosing the best kind of graph you can. You'll notice that within the helpful links section, I have posted your new folder, which is on data analysis and probability. This link looks like it's unimportant, but it's actually one of the best ones here. And then there's a YouTube video on this. All of these things are up here. We're going to go through them right now. Alrighty. Here's my personal lesson. I'm sorry it's yellow. It for some reason changed and I didn't feel like going through and changing everything back. I'll read it to you anyway, so it doesn't matter. The idea here is we're going to go through the different graphs and talk about why you would use them. So if you were in some situation, you can decide, well, should I use a bar graph versus a line graph versus a circle graph versus whatever else. So let's talk about some of the ones. Now, this is kind of a more fun activity when I can actually be in front of you in a classroom because in those situations, you'd be answering these questions and you'd be filling in this stuff. As it is, I'm happy I saved last year's students' responses. You can kind of see what they said. So the idea here is why should you choose the different kind of graph and what makes it different than others? So first off, we have our bar graph. Bar graphs are for comparing things, comparing different groups. The one here is about favorite sports for some students: soccer, softball, basketball, other. So it's good for comparing, good for counting. You can see really easily by looking down the side how many in each one. The big thing here is the data points don't have anything to do with each other. So you're not seeing a trend across the graph. You're just counting and comparing different amounts of things. The next one we have here is a double bar graph, similar in that, again, you're not going to get a trend going across the graph. What you are going to get is another level of comparison. So it's going to be a little bit more in depth. Here they've broken the same graph down, except now we're separating it into girls and boys. So you get a little more information out of it. But again, it's discrete data. Discrete meaning there's no real connection between it. There's no real connection between somebody choosing soccer and somebody choosing softball. It's just a matter of opinion. After that, we have line graph, and line graph, things change. You do get continuous data here. So if you look across the line, this one says Frank's math test grades, and it's the tests going this way and the grade up here. So logic dictates that these tests are happening over time from test 1, 2, 3, 4. You're seeing where Frank's grades are going based on the tests that are happening. So you can kind of get an idea of where Frank's, how Frank's doing in math based on, how he's doing on the tests as they roll along. So it tells a story. You can see something happening over time. Then we have our multiple line graph. Lots of times, most of the time, the bottom line is going to be time. And anytime you have time, you know that there's a continuous set of data. You're comparing something happening over time. So in this case, it's monthly temperatures in 3 African cities: Mombasa, Kenya; Cape Town, South Africa; and Cairo, Egypt. And you can see, if you travel across the line, you can see when it's hot, when it's cold, and so forth in these different places. So you can learn continuously over the course of the graph. So you would pick this kind of graph if you're trying to see something happening over time. That's how line graphs generally work. Histograms are a little bit different. They look like line graphs, like bar graphs, except these things are used to distribute data that you get. So this one here is the results of an exam. So it's going from 0% up to 100%. And you do learn something by looking over the course of the graph. The reason I have bell curve written here is because this is kind of like university. In university, this is how they kind of see where kids are at. This is how they decide pass, fail, if that's something that happens in this class. But the order of the bars matter because they're seeing what kids are in what part of the continuum of grades over the course of it. So it's not quite a bar graph because there is some consistency between them. But it's not quite a line graph because it's not data over time. It's just a snapshot. Okay, so it's just splitting data into ranges of data. Then you have your circle graph, which lots of you should be familiar with. The nice part of a circle graph, and you can see that this circle graph has the degrees in here. Normally it would be the percentages, but we can figure out what the percentages are by figuring out what percent of 360 this degree is. So if I went 45 divided 360, you might remember from Unit 5, part, divide, whole. I would get a decimal, multiply it by 100, and I'd figure out what percent tennis is here. So the good reason to do circle graphs is it gives you 100% of the data. So it's easily comparable between them. This is what percent, this is what percent. It'll always equal 100%. Versus bar graphs where you can't, it's harder. You can do it. You could do this as a circle graph. It just gives you different information. Bar graphs are amounts. Circle graphs are giving you a comparison based on percentages of 100. Then you have your pictograph, which is down here. Pictographs are real cool for younger people, and they are visually stimulating in that it usually picks some amount of something. It's like a bar graph, but a lot more work. And each of the pictures on the pictograph stand for an amount of something. So in this case, 1 apple stands for 5 apples. Okay, so this would be 5, 10, and then like 13. I'm not a huge fan of pictographs. They look all pretty and stuff, but why waste that time when you can just do it as a bar graph? My personal preference, just saying. So this is just going to talk about what would be the point. So here are the different kinds of graphs that we just talked about. Why might someone use a circle graph? It shows percent. Why might someone use a bar graph? It can compare, just as we said, there are amounts, right? A line graph would be used to show change over time. So why you might use a pictograph instead of a bar graph, it's visually appealing and easily read. Again, I prefer bar graphs, sorry, just my personal opinion. This is based on some other stuff. I'm going to skip that, but what I did want to show you was this. Line graphs change over time. So they're easy to draw. They show data and they show the trends of the data. And you can estimate amounts between data points. What that means is if this part right here says 1995 and this says 2000, I can see between the 1995 and 2000 what's happening. It's going up, up, up. So you can use this to make predictions. I could also use this to extrapolate where the line is going to go. So I could look at this and say, okay, based on where we were in 2005, it looks like things were going up and then starting to plateau. So maybe in 2010, we're going to be here or it's starting to go down a bit. You can kind of make some educated guesses based on what's happening. The other thing about line graphs is you have why reasons. So if this was, this one's here talking about Dow Jones, which is something to do with the stock exchange. It's one of the stocks. This is showing you what's happening with that. So if something dropped like this, maybe there was a recession. Maybe, there's just different reasons that a line graph could happen. You couldn't do that within a bar graph nearly as much. Double bar graphs compare two sets of data, which we've kind of discussed already. They show discrete data. And again, you can see that I grabbed that one from there. Circle graphs show percent. So it's nice to be able to see the big size of the sector so you can see and compare, what kind of pie people like best. And pictographs. Here's a YouTube video. This YouTube video is going to help you choose the right graph. So what it does is it gives you a set of data. I'm going to click to it right here. Gives you a set of data and it asks, what might you use to make this into a graph? So it's telling you some activities, telling you some information for each of the silvery marmoset and squirrel monkey, and it wants you to figure out what kind of graph this might be the best choice for. It's posted in the helpful links right here. Give it a watch and make a prediction on your own. Some of you probably are making a prediction based on seeing this right now. What graph might be a smart one to choose? That's going to be the kind of questions that are asked of you. This one right here is a quiz. So if you go to IXL Math here, this one is just going to give you a situation, and then you have to decide which one would make the most sense. Just a quick little activity. You press submit, you get your answer, you move on. Okay, so that's going to be there for you. Here's the textbook, and this one's talking data analysis and probability at the start, which I told you was coming, and we're talking about choosing appropriate graphs. So here's showing you graph A. Now, this is the same information on 3 different graphs, and it's wanting you to decide which is the best graph. So what it's showing you is skateboard sales, and it's giving you months and sales. Skateboard sales, months and sales, skateboard sales, months and sales. So I want you to look at this and think, which one makes the most sense? Well, notice that all of these have time. Okay? Time doesn't work so hot in bar graphs. This one does kind of work. You can see the same trend as you can down here. But almost always when we have continuous data, things that can be compared over time, we're going to use a line graph. So this one does make sense. This one, you can kind of see the trend, but again, we would probably use a line graph. Remember, bar graphs are more for amounts. And you can see why this one here, the pie graph, the circle graph, doesn't make a ton of sense. It's showing you percentage of skateboard sales that happen within those things, but it's a lot easier to figure out your information from something like this. These are the months of the year: January, February, March, April, blah, blah, blah. It shouldn't shock anybody that skateboard sales go up more in the summer because, hey, we live in Canada and, you're not doing too much skateboarding when there's snow on the sidewalk. This will also go through all the different kinds, just like we have. Line graphs tells you stuff about them. Bar graphs tells you stuff about them. This is important because there are going to be questions that you answer that ask you, hey, what's the point of having a bar graph? What's the point of having a line graph? Cool. Go back to this page. It's on page 383. You can get the information here and you can use it. This double bar graph is sideways. And then this is going to be some of the kind of stuff you do. So it's going to ask you stuff like, what are the strengths and limitations? So in other words, what's good about a certain kind of graph? What's bad about a certain kind of graph? So that's kind of a good idea to go back and look at some of the information about these and just see, oh, surprise, look what you can use when you're doing your work here. Here's a question about it. And this page 385 tells you circle graph, strengths, limitations, bar graph, strengths, limitations, same for pictograph, and so forth. Okay. Different examples, asking you to graph it. You decide what kind of graph you're going to use. All right. So that's the game plan here. I'm going to end this video here, give you a chance to try some stuff out, and we will chat this week. Okay. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it much. Bye.